Hey everyone, so this is version 2 of a model paper. This is again another student from one of my classes this semester. And so we're going to look at her paper. She's done it in GCU format, which should look something akin to this. And so let's just get into the actual content. I think she starts off really well. We get a sense of the problems right now, right away. As these financial technologies develop, banks take advantage of these innovations to advance their organization and increase profits. That's awesome. We also get a very reduced version of how banks operate. For those who don't know, banks make money by charging you for fees and such. However, the big way that banks make a lot of money is in interest on things like loans, on those kinds of investments. And those are linked to how much money is in the accounts that they have. And so there is a correlation between how many accounts a bank has, how much money that bank has, and how much money they can lend out. But it's not part of our class, so the student understands it, and they've reduced it really well down. It's a very simple language. And her audience is banks, so they'll know this. And I think she does really well in starting to talk to those banks about, hey, you have this issue in that your market is largely commoditized. And she's not saying that, but it's true. These large and international banks, they have access to all these portions and these people, but they're missing these unbanked populations. What's missing for me is why that matters to the bank. And so I think giving this problem a little bit more presence and saying things like, hey, this is about your ability to put more money out into the economy. This is about your ability to make more money on loans, because these small people who have $50 in the bank, $100 in the bank, you could amass a ton of them. And that's just more money coming into you. She does give me a great definition. This is one of those ways that we talked about in class. I don't want a dictionary definition, but she goes to the researchers and she allows them to define it. Great. I love it. She goes into the unbanked populations, and I think this is where I'd really like to see her shift this to those banks and being like, hey, banks, this is a missed opportunity for you. That if you developed tools, you could be banking for these unbanked populations. And that, of course, would mean more money in your on your rolls, which would mean more money that could go out in the form of loans and such. And then she goes to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is that they don't know how to engage the unbanked markets, that there's problems communicating with them. Great. They don't have the infrastructure. I would love to know what that looks like, especially for who she's talking about. This could be roads and bridges. It could just be that there's not a bank in their general region, which is why a lot of banks went to online banking. And there are certain banks like Ally that only online bank. And so especially now, you guys probably don't know this, but there used to be ATM fees. And so if you went to a bank that was not your bank to pull out your money, they would charge you a fee on that money. We don't have that system as much anymore. And so I definitely think that she's talking about all these things. But again, I think that situating this problem into that idea that this is about a missed opportunity, an opportunity we're missing to allow these people to be banking. And it could be, again, smart, partially financial, but it also could be PR. I mean, what greater pitch to somebody like Wells Fargo right now? It's like, look, you've had 2 years of scandals in treating customers very poorly. This is a great way to build some goodwill with your services. And talking about how that would improve brand, for example. I think that all of that would be really great. And she could give that presence here in the intro. She doesn't have to do all of it, but doing some of that would be really nice. And so we get to her thesis. Leaders of national and international banks should increase their bank's profits. I don't know that we even need should increase their bank's profits. We should just say should apply mobile banking solutions to provide financial services for the global unbanked population. Again, I think that putting this why as the only why really restricts the argument. We can't go into things like branding. We can't go into things like PR, which are all part of a business, including a banking business. So then we go, okay, well, how do we do it? Again, great claims start off the bat. Banks should verify that this community has the infrastructure. Okay, well, what does that mean? So she gets into, well, mobile banking is this. I'm not seeing much of a connection. I wonder about her organization at the moment. This is where paragraph cards really come into play. Why is this the first paragraph? I'm not sure about it. She talks about infrastructure up here, but I think that maybe altering this claim a little bit or moving it would make it a little bit more logical. It depends on what her later claims are. I'm just reading this as I would read it for anybody else. So great evidences here. If you're noticing, she has at least a few sentences discussing that evidence between each piece of evidence. Another thing that I really appreciate about her writing is that look at how she's introduced this quote. We've talked about balancing the need for information and the less of information, right? Here we get a really good definition of what is not too much information. Here, it's really important that we know that this is a Ghanaian study to identify these characteristics of communities, because if we understand that this is about an unbanked community that has these motivations to join banking, before we get to our quote, it lends it that much more credibility. But notice the first name is not there. Notice the title. All of that meaningless information is gone. And that's where I've been trying to really reiterate that context matters, right? Being very aware of the context here is a very powerful tool. And so if you see here, this context is perfect. It's exactly what we want. It lends credibility, but it's not too much. It's not giving us all of this blank exposition to seemingly just up the word count. It's actually really trying to help build credibility for why this information is so important. So yeah, this is a step-by-step plan. So I might change the thesis a little bit, because I would want the proposal to be a plan, being like leaders of national and international banks should implement I'm trying to think of how I would put it. But this is a step-by-step process. And so initiating that in our thesis would be very powerful. And just saying that banks could go through this process to identify those unbanked populations that would provide them with the greatest returns for their investment. Those returns don't have to be in profits. They can be in unmarked things like PR, like marketing tools. This is exactly the kinds of choices that companies are making when they invest in sustainable things, in development. Apple today delivered 100,000 things to Tim Cook's home state. I think it's Alabama. That is not just out of the goodness of his heart. I'm pretty sure that he's a good guy. I've heard a lot about him. However, there's still reasons for it. It's not blank. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So that's where we can really go through this and have that in the thesis, saying that banks can go through this process and identify those places that will give them the greatest return of investment. Okay, well, what's the first step in that process? Well, first verify or identify those communities that give you the best return on investment. Okay, well, what happens when we've identified them? Okay, once we have identified them, the bank then analyzes that community's needs. And I think that that's okay. The claim is really long, and I don't like that it's the second half of the sentence, but we can play with this a little bit. And once we have this down a little bit better, we identify that this is a process we're hoping the bank implements through whatever means, right? Then we can play with our transitions here. And so we can put at least the first sentiment up in the previous paragraph. So saying, now that the bank has ensured that the infrastructure is there, it needs to verify the needs, or it needs to verify the desires of that community. And then we go to the next paragraph, and it's just that. Try not to be so didactic. Again, I'm dealing with this in about 3 minutes. So now that we understand this proposal a little bit better, it's easier to look at. So here this is all about, hey, this bank now needs to identify the financial needs. It's like, okay, well, how do they do that? And here's a step-by-step process. And we go, okay, well, once we have those needs met, or once we've identified those needs, how do we deliver products to address those needs? Notice we have a shift in tone. So the bank should identify the financial needs. We're identifying a need here. I think that shift in tone is a little jarring. And so we can talk about some of the financial needs rather than just being like, they need this. The whole point of the second paragraph is we need to identify what they need. What if they don't need a savings product? What if most do? Why can't we initiate that? This is also a bare assertion because it says that they all do, or a gross generalization. We don't think they all do. In fact, some may not. And so we definitely can just say many unbanked populations demonstrate a need for savings products. And so banks, maybe that's the transition in the paragraph before. And then we get to this paragraph and like banks can then deliver savings products utilizing mobile technologies. And this is all about how that works. I believe that's what it's about. And so, yeah, creating a paragraph about a product that a bank can develop, I think would be far better if it was qualified as a claim and as that was the claim versus they need this. Saying, a lot of the population, one of the needs that we identify in many parts of the population is the need for savings programs for unbanked populations. And the next paragraph, topic sentences. Banks can increase their portfolios or their bankrolls by providing a savings product to these unbanked populations. And but that's a very specific claim, and then it broadens back out here to implementing mobile banking technology. And so I think that, again, the organization could be a little bit better in terms of where are we going. That's a very, very specific claim that she had before about a very specific product. Here this broadens back out, and I think that that's very awkward for a reader, especially a banking professional. Maybe after we identify needs, then we go, okay, well, banks meet these needs by implementing banking technologies. And then one of those technologies that they can implement is a savings program. Okay, well, one of the problems in that savings program is how do we get them to deposit the money, especially without a brick and mortar? And so here is, well, we can find creative ways. And so I think that reorganizing would be very, very crucial here. This is their why, their financial improvements. This is a sort of social justice paragraph. But again, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the bank. However, PR does. And so here, rather than making this about the what, we can make it about the why. By creating marketing products to address the remaining barrier in adoption of these technologies, the banks can actually create a marketing PR program about these unbanked communities that will drive banked communities back to their bankrolls. Meaning, a lot of people left Wells Fargo recently because of all of the fallout from what they did. And it wasn't the CEO as much as It was the system. We would call this the procedures of the corporation created a value problem. In my field, we would call it the procedural rhetoric of the corporation created a problem. But regardless, this is the reality. The reality is that a lot of people left. They had a lot of PR problems for a little while. And so if they were to do something like this, imagine how they could rebrand themselves as the bank for social purposes, like the bank that brings banking platforms to the people who need it the most, these people who are unbanked, despite the quote unquote cost. So we get to this last paragraph, and I think we're seeing a lot of sort of things that this student cares about, which is really telling. This is about those people, which I think is very important. However, that is not necessarily going to drive the banks to do action. And so for the banks, what is in it for them? What is their new bliss? What is their end of this road? I think that would be a great way to look at it. So talking about increasing profitability, bankrolls, and creating a marketing program that are all integrated into driving new adoption of banking around the world. Talking about competing against non-competition, which is a term that this student and I have discussed at length. These things are going to be much more telling to a bank. And so we have to remember who our audience is. That's who we really want to talk to. It's admirable that she wants to talk about the people, but the bankers are not that interested in the people. And I don't mean that against them. I mean that's not, again, the processes and procedures of their corporation do not include that as a value. And so they're not motivated to think that way. So we have to talk about ways in which they are motivated to think. So since I forgot last time, let's talk about some of these. So everything looks good here. Some things just to keep in check. Every author should be last name, comma, first initial. We don't change the order of the authors. So hopefully they stayed in alphabetical. It's much more likely that these were equal authors. And if you look down here, these were not equal authors. And so they went alphabetical to sort of make it fair. And these people went in terms of who had the most responsibility. But that's correct. The year comes next. This comma, I don't think should be here. Oh, never mind. There's no comma. Oh, it's period. I had a little smudge on my screen. Notice the next thing that comes is the title of the essay, and that they're all lower cases. One exception that is missed here is that this P is actually capitalized. So it's the first letter, and the first letter after a colon or semicolon, it's the subtitle. So that's the only mistake there. It's fine. Notice that the journal title is italicized and it is capped correctly. Volume, issue, page range, and the DOI. Also, some people are getting mixed up with this. If you're going to give me a URL, you need to make sure that it's the stable URL or the permalink, because if it's not cited correctly, what can happen is I can click on it to go to look at your source. And if it's not cited correctly throughout, I click on the source to verify that it's peer reviewed at least. Then I can give you credit even though it's not cited correctly. Then we only have one mistake, not two. But if the link doesn't work, that's the end for me. Like, I already shouldn't have to click on it because it should be perfect. And so if I have to click on it, that's already a problem. If I then have to, if I'm supposed to have to look it up from there, I just don't. And I, again, as we talked about in class, assume it is not peer reviewed because I was not given the information to prove that it was. But this is correct. This is a PDF file, which is not necessarily cited the same way. It's why it's cited the way it is. Also, because it is a PDF file and it is from a database, I would not consider it peer-reviewed. But yeah, this going through looks pretty good. This is how we should have a URL down here. So make sure you're doing this correctly. If you have questions, be sure to ask. Put it in the questions to instructor form if more than one student might have that question. Otherwise, I hope this is more helpful. Again, these are all just meant to be models for how you guys should be writing. So hopefully you're seeing this. The one thing that this student did really well is none of her paragraphs were about the problem. They were all focused on the solution. What does the bank do? There was a process, and then that process was then justified. I think that that was a powerful sort of organizational scheme that didn't quite work because I feel like the process went in weird ways at times with the terms of the scope. We were talking about a specific thing they could do, and then we broadened it out again. And I think that organizing it more effectively would make this a really strong paper. So again, if you need anything, let me know. This is 2. I hope to do at least 3. But yeah, there you go.